Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, where we bring you the latest news, issues and changes happening in the energy sector. This week, we're focusing on batteries. Europe plans to ramp up battery energy storage capacity over the next decade to help decarbonise the economy. Our own journalists here at Montel News have covered the issue extensively in recent weeks. But it's a tricky balancing act for battery developers who must navigate the complex markets to optimise revenue, and there are pressures to install batteries to take excess renewable energy off the grid to tackle the risk of negative pricing. And some countries have seen a massive rise in available battery capacity this year alone. Are they the answer to the green energy transition? And what are some of the complexities that follow this simple sounding solution? Well, over 600 kilometres away from Stockholm, in the East Billund Power Reserve in northern Sweden, sits the largest battery in the Nordics. One of the project managers on the ground there sent us these recordings from the plant.
I'm standing at the gates of Neoen's second battery in Sweden, East Billund Power Reserve. With its installed capacity of 93.9 megawatts, it is the largest battery in the Nordics. East Billund Power Reserve is situated in the deep forest of northern Sweden, 100 kilometers from the closest larger town and 3.5 kilometers from the closest house. This battery is situated in one of Sweden's largest wind farm clusters, with more than 200 wind turbines. The amount of batteries in this whole battery park adds up to the equivalent of 1,500 electric cars. The battery will primarily be used for balancing the power system by selling ancillary services to the transmission system operator Svenska Kraftnät. As I'm taking a few steps inside the gate, I find myself on a gravel surface the size of 2 football fields. On this surface stand 36 green containers from Nordic, filled with batteries. The containers are standard size 20 feet containers, so approximately 6 meters long, 2.5 meters wide and 3 meters high. In front of every 2 containers, there is an outdoor transformer stepping up the voltage to 32 kilovolts. These transformers are connected to switchgear containers, and these containers are then connecting the battery to the substation just 50 meters behind me across the road, where the grid company Neoen connects the battery and some wind farms in the nearby area to the 130 kilovolt regional grid. The construction is almost complete, and in the coming months, the testing and commissioning will also be finished. Once the battery has been qualified with the transmission system operator, Svenska Kraftnät, the battery will go into operation. This is planned to happen during the middle of the spring 2025.
Well, I'm pleased to be joined now by Laetitia Prot from Neoen, who led the development of that battery project, and also Lars Lysdal from Rystad Energy, who consults on batteries, solar PV, and sustainable fuels. Now, a warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Hello.
I'd like to start with you, Laetitia. We heard from your colleague Christian there about the battery you have in Sweden. I'd like to maybe, if you could clarify the main uses of batteries. The wholesale market is generally divided into several timeframes. So we have the day ahead, we have the intraday market, and then we have the balancing market, where, as far as I'm aware, that's the biggest use for batteries. Could you maybe explain the uses of batteries and how it works?
Yes, sure. So this East Billund battery we have been discussing in your introduction. It's been built on the main purpose of doing frequency regulation for the grid. So it's basically a capacity-based business model where a short duration of batteries can address it. It's really like the megawatt part of the battery that will be valued, and not the megawatt hour part, the energy part of the battery, because the activation time is very quick but very seldom. Like it's, for example, it's either continuous small activation or some sporadic activation in case of major default on the grid to avoid blackout in the country. So, but this is not really very long duration storage. So and most of the batteries in Sweden that we have today have been built for this purpose, to do like frequency regulation mainly. The magic of this Isbillen battery product is that it's the first of its kind extendable battery, meaning it's been designed in terms of civil work, electrical work, to add a second hour of storage on it when market conditions change and the future use cases of battery start to materialize and make sense. But so far it's been mostly driven by capacity market and not so much of this intraday or day ahead arbitrage nor balancing business case. It's really like capacity and grid services driven.
Okay, so it's basically helping to keep the lights on when there is a massive problem in the grid, where there's a drop or rise in frequency. So what kind of problems do batteries aim to solve, Laetitia?
It's actually not a new thing. That like all the grid networks have always needed some security reserve in all the countries in case there is a trip of a power plant or a big storm cutting a line, or like when something happens, you need to have a backup plan to maintain the grid. But it's been historically driven by like conventional generators, and in some countries mostly thermal generators. So the idea is that batteries today are trying to replace this conventional asset to do the same service, and batteries are just quicker to react and cheaper to render the service. So that's the innovation here. So we're trying to displace all conventional assets from this use case.
And obviously that's much cleaner if it's done with batteries that are full of renewable energy, if you like. I've seen some latest figures from Sweden, Laetitia, saying that installed capacity in the most used balancing market. I know that's not where you're saying you're not active, or where that battery is not used so much, but it's risen from 80 megawatts at the start of the year to 530 at the beginning of October. Has that surprised you, the extent of the growth in battery capacity?
Yeah, no, that's not surprising. And it's very similar to what has happened to the UK, to France, to Germany, like all the market maturing with like battery penetration very fast and displacing this conventional asset from the market. So it's actually even now going to be double the number you're mentioning. So it's going to be up to 1 gigawatt, potentially by year-end, qualified on the ancillary services. So it's a huge market, and so Isbillen as its own. It's like 10% of the market share, the battery we've been talking about. And we have another battery also in Sweden, totaling like 145 megawatt with both of them. So yes, it's a very rapid battery rollout. And then we will need to think about the next use case, because it's already saturated. If you look at the market size, the need is only half of the size of the battery fleet now. So we need to find more innovative use case for battery going forward.
And what does it do to the business case? Have you seen this massive rollout? Certainly, is it as profitable? It can't be as profitable as it was like a year or so ago.
Yes, so we're exploring now more energy-based use cases with the battery. And so, for example, other ancillary services like AFR, MFR, which are actually restoration reserve instead of just containment reserve, meaning it's a longer reactive time of reserve and potentially more energy intensive one. So we are exploring these ones. And then we are also exploring, of course, as you mentioned at the very beginning, the arbitrage use case. So basically trading with batteries, capturing low and high prices and trying to balance the system. This can bring new revenue streams. But I think, this is very promising for sure. But what is even more interesting, I think, for the future use cases of batteries in Sweden is the bilateral agreement we can try to do with the main producer or main consumers. For example, on the nuclear ramping up, we have been doing this in Finland with TVO, the operator of this Olkiluoto 3, the brand new EPR in Finland. So we are providing a direct service to them to help them ramp up their 300 megawatt new facility. So it's a bilateral agreement and service to them. And maybe in Sweden we will have similar other cases with some nuclear upgrade for Olkiluoto 1 and 2 or for Forsmark nuclear plant, where they may need some backup and they realize that battery is just cheaper and quicker to do these services. And also some other use case that could be interesting to explore in Sweden. And they are starting to explore it, I think, in Germany and in France to do some decongestion on the grid lines. We know it's very known in the energy sector that the grid is full and it will take 10 to 15 years to reinvest in all the grid infrastructure. And battery could actually help to unlock some congested area or a congested line to bring more access to new producer or consumers by providing like momentaneous decongestion. And at Neoen, we have already done this kind of services since 2021 already with our Victoria and Big battery in Australia. It's a 300 megawatt battery doing similar services and providing a huge benefits to the local society because it's also lowering the electricity price for the end user by allowing more power flows and avoid big price gap between the countries on interconnector, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, you've highlighted the use cases very eloquently there, Laetitia. But Lars, if I can turn to you, have you been surprised by this rapid growth in battery capacity, certainly in the Nordic region, elsewhere in Europe?
Absolutely, and I think it's been predominantly driven not only by kind of the variability in the consumption of electricity and the variability in the generation of electricity, but also the fact that these systems, so the battery storage systems, have come down tremendously in cost, probably around half in terms of total system cost over the last two and a half years in Europe. And that kind of drives new demand again. So we've seen tremendous demand for battery storage in the UK, and Germany has been for many years, but UK now for a couple of years. And then Sweden has been quite hot also in Northern Europe. And then we're starting to see signs of this in Denmark also. And then in terms of Southern Europe, Spain, we're seeing a lot of interest, predominantly driven by solar. So there's a kind of a synergy aspect there. But also auctions coming in Greece and Turkey and Hungary. So yeah, it's a lot of people opening up for this because it's like Laetitia mentions, it can be quite a quick and cheap, relatively cheap way to solve a lot of the grid issues or grid stability issues.
A cheap way to decongest, if you like, or unlock some of the congestion that's on those networks. So that's a very interesting use case, I think. But the sentiment is that we need to continue to do this and to find ways to do it. But what are the challenges in increasing the capacity or growing out, expanding, rolling out these storage systems, Lars?
I'm not sure if there's an issue with this rolling out the systems themselves. We're seeing new use cases, like I mentioned, a lot. Like Europe hasn't been much of a market in terms of co-locating with solar or wind. We are seeing some examples of the solar co-location in Europe. I think it's 2 assets now. And there's some more push on the co-location with wind also. So that's kind of a new use case, I guess. And another thing that we're seeing is that because the costs are coming down so much, and like Laetitia is alluding to, is that you can actually now justify the investment of a standalone battery storage plant with only doing the revenue projection for day ahead and intraday energy trading. So basically charging the battery and paying for electricity when the prices are low, and then discharging and getting the revenue when the prices are higher. And this is completely new. And we're seeing this in Texas right now, actually. The majority of the new energy storage systems there are the economics behind the investments are based on energy trading and not and the grid services, the kind of legacy services for batteries are kind of a bonus in addition, potentially, because I think a lot of investors are scared of investing in batteries with some of these markets being saturated from over investments in batteries. So maybe that's what you're referring to as a risk item. We've seen that in Germany in 2018-19 and in the UK October last year, when the prices for these services kind of plummeted. And I think we're starting to see that in Sweden also, that there's basically too many batteries competing for the same service, that being grid service.
So the ancillary service, so they're moving more into day ahead and intraday trading. That's a very interesting development in that sense. But what kind of size of batteries are we talking about here, Lars?
Yeah, so like a big battery in Germany is typically 200, 250 megawatts, and I think they're a little bit smaller in the UK. But Europe is really lagging in terms of battery size. Like in the US, you have several gigawatt hours. You have one big one in New York, which is actually replacing gas peaker plants, which I believe is around 2 gigawatt hours. I can't remember exactly. But there are some examples of co-located batteries that are 3 and 4 gigawatt hours. So this is, incredible scale. Just for reference, so a 4 gigawatt hour battery with a 4-hour duration is typically 1 gigawatt, and a big nuclear reactor is typically 1 gigawatt. So it gives you a little bit of reference for how big these systems are starting to get.
Okay, but that's fascinating. I think, certainly things are developing very quick, and I'd like to move over to the technological advances that we can maybe see coming in the years ahead. I'd like to come back to that and talk to Laetitia about that later as well. But Lars, there's been a lot of news, certainly in the Nordics and elsewhere, about battery manufacturers experiencing severe problems. So we've had Northvolt in Sweden, and Freyr in Norway. There are others that can be mentioned.
Or first of all,
what's the underlying issue here? What's the problem?
Difficult. And this is battery manufacturing, battery cell manufacturing especially, is a very extremely difficult sector to be in terms of ramping up production at high volume and being profitable. And these, like the two examples you mentioned, Freyr and Northvolt, are startup companies that basically starting from scratch. They don't have any they're not industrial spin-off companies. And then what happened to them and to all the players in Europe is that they were basically hit by a perfect storm, which kind of started with the Inflation Reduction Act being sanctioned in the US, which then made the incentives so good to produce battery cells, that many of them, it was very difficult to prioritize European production over American production. And that's what happened with Freyr, is that they had to kind of prioritize their Georgia plant over their plant in Norway. And then there's many examples of that, like Tesla moving there, Northvolt also focusing more on the Canadian plant which has US similar incentives. And then you had a lot of, in 2022-23, oil prices increased a lot, and that meant that a lot of investors shifted their focus more over to oil and gas. And then you had rising interest rates and very high inflation. So then in a capital-intensive industry, it was very hard to raise money and more difficult to pay off the loans. And then on top of that, you had kind of the EV slowdown. So the electric vehicle demand in Europe, which is still growing, but a lot of the automakers are kind of scaling back their production forecasting. And then they are requiring less battery cells to buy from these battery producers. So that was another one on top of everything.
So it's kind of a bit of a perfect storm here, combined with the attractiveness of the USA and the IRA as a site for production for these sources. But Laetitia, if I can turn to you and ask, really, does it really matter where these batteries are produced? I mean, it seems, as Lars has mentioned, and I think you insinuated as well, that you hinted at the costs are coming down quite rapidly. Does it matter if they're Chinese, American, or Scandinavian?
I mean, it actually matters when it comes to carbon footprint and traceability and forced labor topic, which are very important to us. So yes, it matters, but at the same time, if you imagine like big Chinese manufacturers installing like gigafactories in Europe with a good level of carbon footprint and traceability, then for us that's fine. And at the end we want maybe security of supply, to have short delivery time for batteries and good carbon footprint and like sound companies. And also we need to remind that in stationary grid scale battery we're doing in our business. For example, in East Billion Power Reserve, the battery we have been discussing earlier, there it's actually only close to 30% coming from the battery cells only. So it's not only about battery cells, it's the whole you have a lot also of electrical equipment, civil and electrical engineering and works, and also project management, if you look at the whole capex. So it's an important debate, and it's nice to have industry in Europe, but it's not the only driver for us as end users of the whole battery system, I would say.
Do you think we'll continue to see more, local manufacturers in Europe struggle with competition from China and the US? There is talk about the batteries being compared to the European solar industry, for example. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
Solar industry, as Mario Draghi said it in his report, solar is a bit too late. It's difficult to catch up in front of Chinese manufacturers. Battery, maybe there is still room to go for it, to have a European champion. But I'm not sure. It's not really my area of expertise.
Sure. But Lars, what's your view here? What are your thoughts in terms of European versus Asian competition? And is it that the subsidies are far greater in China and the USA, so the Europeans will always struggle to compete and be competitive?
I think it will be challenging, but because like you mentioned, not only do the Chinese have a lot of subsidies and the Americans do also, but the Chinese also have a lower labor cost, and but most importantly, they have the momentum and scale of this. The Chinese government set out a plan to become the best in the world in battery cell manufacturing as part of EV or electric vehicle manufacturing in 2004 as a governmental program. So this is what they're reaping the benefits of now. So they started basically 20 years before the US, and we don't see any major initiatives in the EU yet. Not that have been sanctioned. There's Critical Raw Materials Act, and there's some project support here and there, but it's nowhere near the scale needed. You have to get on the same scale as the Inflation Reduction Act for it to be really meaningful. But having said that, there are some really good projects out there. There are some projects that are focusing more on energy storage, which is easier, lower entry barriers to get into. And then that meaning there's a lot of gigafactories in Europe also being set up to make these energy storage systems. And they are more inclined to use newer players, I would think, because they're not as they don't have the same kind of scale of manufacturing and locking in one battery cell for 7 years like the automakers do, and not the same level of quality needed, perhaps. And also some of the new and some of the European manufacturers are Asian and or Chinese and Korean players setting up factories in Europe. So that's promising. And then also some of the startups are more focused on one plant. I think a major issue with Northvolt was that they invested in or targeted 6 cell factories, and then cathode manufacturing and battery cell recycling, and then energy storage systems manufacturing in Poland. And they had some solid state investment. So there was so much spread out for one small startup initially. It's very challenging. So I don't think they are kind of the example of everybody else. So hopefully hopefully some of the European makers, startup companies will also make it.
I mean, Laetitia, Lars mentioned the fact that a lot more batteries are coming into the day ahead and intraday time frame. Is this something that's interesting for you? And what are your views here?
Yeah, it's very interesting indeed. However, the Swedish market itself is not so liquid, and there is not so much market potential for these spreads today, at least. Like Germany and Central Europe may have more interesting opportunity in that market. But here maybe, in early next year, 25, we're switching to the 15 minutes market instead of hourly trading windows. So this may bring more opportunities to trade intraday. Let's see.
So if the conditions were right, but the market conditions were there, then you'd be very interested in that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. What about the regulatory environment? You mentioned the 15-minute time frame, the trading time frame on intraday and day ahead, but intraday, sorry. But what about the regulatory framework? Is that fit for purpose here to continue to give the store batteries a boost?
Yes, I think it's very important that you mention it, and maybe I wanted to comment earlier on where are the challenges for battery rollout in Europe and specifically in Sweden. I think we have some good European tools like Picasso and Mari to give a market design and access for Swedish batteries, but Sweden is a bit lagging behind in implementing this. Like it's Sweden itself is like 2 years late compared to the rest of European TSOs, namely on AFR market. So today we cannot access to this market. We need to wait 2 to 3 more years before we can have this access. And then for example, on co-location, I think Lars mentioned it. It's a very good potential to be able to team up with wind and solar to do something smart together. However, for example, today there is some regulatory issues like in Sweden, you need to be physically behind the meter of such wind and solar wind farm to be able to arbitrate together with the battery. Whereas in several countries of Europe and in a lot of countries, actually, you are allowed to do it virtually, which provides even more potential to balance each other on the same grid, but not necessarily behind the meter physically. So today in Sweden, we cannot even do it in the same price zone, which is a bit an issue. So hopefully it will change at some point. And then and the last challenge I see on the regulatory aspect is on the grid fees structures. So what I mean by grid fees is the cost of using the grid with the battery. And it depends how DSOs and TSOs are seeing the battery. Some of them, like in Finland, they are very good at it. They just look at the net usage of the grid. Whereas in Sweden, you are paying grid fees on the capacity, energy, in-feed and out-feed, like in everywhere you're paying fees. And it's by a factor of 50, the grid fees, the cost of operating a battery because of grid fees is like 50 times higher in Sweden compared to Finland, for example. So it's just highlighting the fact that there are room for improvement in how the regulation is made and how battery are perceived by the DSO and TSO, namely in light of the cost of using the grid and the tax associated to it, because half of the grid fees is made of tax in Sweden. It's the energy tax. And I'm not really sure it's really the right way to develop more batteries.
And that's also the case in other countries as well in Europe. I think I've heard a lot about being having to pay grid fees on charging the battery and also releasing the energy back into the system. So obviously there's a need for some kind of harmonization and standardization across the board here. Lars, what are your feelings, Lars? I mean, what would be your regulatory? What would be on the top of your regulatory wish list, as it were?
I think co-locating with solar should be prioritized and making that no regulatory hurdles on that. I think there's a lot of existing solar plants that could benefit from this. And if they could install batteries quite easily and then you don't have the interconnection queue issue, which you see a lot in the US and is starting to build up also in Europe. And for one solar asset, they could increase their kind of utilization of the interconnection they have, because they produce a lot of power midday, which is then closing to the peak or the peak production is closing to the kind of interconnection capacity they have, and then it's a very low evening and morning, and then obviously no when the sun is not shining. But if they could shift some of that over to the generation in the peak over to with batteries over to morning and evening, then they can utilize and generate more, because often they're also curtailed. So they could in theory produce more than they are doing, but they're kind of shut off from producing more. So if they could smoothen out that generation, then that would be advantageous to them and the whole kind of grid system.
Absolutely, that's like using solar power at night, which would be the perfect answer here in many ways. But I'd like to sort of just finish off by talking about the technology and what we can see coming. I mean, are we still a very long way of having seasonal battery storage, Lars?
I think having like batteries that have the duration of weeks is still a long way away. There's like outside of lithium-ion, there's a lot of new technologies with flow batteries and gravity and cryogenic, but it's still quite immature and not really produced at scale. There are some efforts, some of them are quite good, but in what the issue is with this longer duration storage technologies is that you're then competing with basically gas power peaker plants, which are then installed. They are mature technology and they operate quite cheaply, relatively speaking, to these new technologies. And they have the capex sunk. So that's a tough market to get into, I think. I think what we will see is that the lithium ion that we see today will increase in duration and eat into more and more, like now it's a good system, or a good system today paired with solar can generate power 24/7, basically, all through the night. But you could have batteries that are such duration that it's basically can generate power 2 to 3 days, if the economics could kind of support that. But that's still a few years away. But we're seeing a tremendous cost decrease on these systems, and then that opens up new applications that we probably don't understand today. And that is largely driven by China and Europe, actually. But the important thing is the manufacturing scale of these systems is increasing so much, because you've gone from kind of single production systems with a lot of labor to scaling up this into manufacturing lines and standardizing all the componentry, making it all work together, rather than kind of shopping different parts into a system that, from legacy kind of power electronics and components. Now you're making complete battery systems that are also with inverters, so they go directly onto the grid through a transformer, but as one kind of produced system rather than different componentry underneath it.
I agree with Lars. I think it would be an interesting breakthrough to have weekly storage capability, because, for example, when you have a windy week in Sweden, I mean, the wind is likely to stay a few days, so you'd be happy to displace it to the next week. And not only by 1 hour, because it will not solve the issue. And I've heard that, for example, data center could be helping on that, because they're apparently able to display data from one data center to another, and thus doing some like GSS style weekly storage response. But let's see.
No, it's all very exciting. I know we've talked about in this pod in previous episodes about dealing with the magical German word Dunkelflaute when it's dark in winter and there's no wind. But so hopefully storage can meet some of those challenges. So thank you very much, Laetitia and Lars, for joining me on the Montel Weekly podcast. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure it's a very exciting section. I think it's very fast moving. So thank you again.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Laetitia.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Lars.